On a frozen Christmas night in a forgotten mountain town, a police officer saw something moving in the snow that should not have been alive. A tiny black puppy was dragging a torn bag through a deadly blizzard, guarding a secret that would change 3 lives forever. What was inside that bag would test faith, loyalty, and the meaning of family in the coldest season of all. Before the story begins, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please press subscribe to support our channel and help us continue sharing stories of hope and quiet miracles. Snow fell relentlessly over Cambria Ridge, a remote mountain spine that rose like the frozen backbone of the world above the small town of Pinecrest. The storm had begun before dusk and grew crueler with every passing hour, layering the streets in white silence, sealing doorways, swallowing footsteps, and bending pine trees until they groaned like wounded animals. Pinecrest itself was the kind of town people forgot unless winter forced them to remember it existed. One main road, a cluster of warm-lit shops, a shuttered sawmill, and rows of modest homes crouched beneath snow-laden roofs. Christmas lights blinked faintly through frost-glazed windows, fighting the storm with fragile color. Tonight, the world felt ancient, as if winter itself were an old god testing who still had the will to move. Officer Caleb Rowan drove slowly through this white dominion, his patrol truck humming like a lone heartbeat in the frozen dark. Caleb was 37, tall and broad-shouldered, with the solid build of someone shaped by years of discipline rather than vanity. His dark hair was cropped short in quiet defiance of the chaos he patrolled, and a thin scar stretched across his right eyebrow, a relic of a past he never spoke about on duty. His eyes were steady, gray like overcast steel, the kind that noticed details others overlooked, but carried a weight of restraint that hinted at loss carefully buried. Once, years ago, he had been warmer, quicker to laugh. A fatal call on a winter highway had taken that from him, along with the woman he loved. Since then, duty had become both shield and compass. He drove not because he hoped to save the world, but because stopping meant listening to memories he could no longer outrun. The wipers struggled against freezing snow as the headlights carved tunnels of light through the storm. The radio crackled softly with distant reports of stalled cars and power outages. But the road Caleb took now stretched empty, black beneath shifting white. Then something moved at the edge of his vision. He eased off the accelerator. At first, it looked like drifting debris, until it staggered, slipped, and tried again. A small black shape fought its way through knee-deep snow, dragging something behind it. Caleb braked, heart tightening before his mind could reason why. He stepped out into the storm, cold slashing instantly through his uniform. The wind howled around him, but the creature did not run. It was a German shepherd puppy, no more than 4 months old, its black coat dusted white with ice, ribs faintly visible beneath soaked fur. One hind leg buckled awkwardly, scraped raw and bleeding where bone pressed too close beneath skin. Yet in its jaws, it clutched a torn duffel bag with a grip so fierce it seemed fused to its will. The puppy's ears were half upright, still too young to hold fully erect, trembling with both exhaustion and resolve. Its eyes, dark, alert, rimmed with frost, locked onto Caleb with a low growl vibrating from its chest. It was not the growl of aggression. It was the sound of something terrified of losing what it had already nearly lost. Caleb crouched slowly, hands open, voice low and steady against the storm. The puppy did not advance, did not retreat. Snow accumulated on its back as if the mountain itself were trying to claim it. Caleb moved closer and gently reached for the bag. The puppy resisted for one trembling second. Then its strength gave out. The duffel fell open in the snow. Inside lay another life. A cream-colored German shepherd puppy, even smaller, no more than 3 months old. Its body curled unnaturally stiff with cold. Pale fur was matted with ice. Tiny paws pulled tight against its chest. Its breathing was so shallow, Caleb had to lean close to see the faint rise beneath its ribs. The cold had already begun stealing color from its tongue. For a suspended moment, the storm seemed to fall silent in Caleb's ears. No collars hung from either neck, no tags, no nearby houses, only wilderness, wind, and 2 abandoned hearts on the edge of extinction. Caleb did not hesitate. He wrapped both puppies into his coat, the black one still clinging weakly to the torn bag as if it were part of its body, and ran for the truck. The cold bit through every layer, yet the heat of small, fragile bodies against his chest burned with urgent life. Inside the vehicle, he turned the heater to full blast and called dispatch with clipped clarity, reporting severely injured animals requiring immediate veterinary intervention. The black puppy trembled violently, but refused to move away from the cream one, shifting only enough to press its small body protectively against the other. Caleb studied them as they shook beneath the growing warmth. The black puppy, despite pain and fatigue, kept lifting its head toward the cream one, nudging gently, issuing faint whines that sounded more like prayers than sounds. Caleb, who had witnessed fear in men far larger than this trembling animal, felt something unfamiliar tighten his throat. He drove toward Pinecrest with careful speed, one gloved hand extended back to steady the small guardianship unfolding behind him. Outside, Cambria Ridge vanished beneath blowing snow, but inside the truck, two lives flickered stubbornly against the dark, bound not by blood alone, but by a devotion that no storm had yet managed to break. The storm worsened as Officer Caleb Rowan sped toward Pinecrest, the patrol truck carving through drifts that reached nearly to the headlights. The heater fought the cold, but it felt like trying to warm an entire mountain with a candle. The black puppy, later to be called Rook, lay curled protectively around the smaller cream pup, nudging it with soft, desperate whines. Caleb kept glancing at the rear seat, each time feeling a jolt of fear at how still the smaller one had become. He pushed the vehicle harder. The veterinary clinic glowed like a lantern in the dark, one of the few buildings in Pinecrest still awake during the storm. Its old wooden sign creaked in the wind. Whitlock Animal Care. Inside, the lights burned warm and golden, a stark contrast to the blue storm swirling around it. The front door burst open as Caleb rushed in, carrying both puppies inside his coat. The warmth struck him like a wave. Behind the reception counter stood Dr. Nora Whitlock, a woman in her late 50s with hair the color of faded ash tied into a loose braid that never seemed to stay neat for long. Her face was lined not with age alone, but with decades of sleepless nights spent fighting for lives too small to speak. She wasn't tall, barely reaching Caleb's shoulder, but her presence filled any room with a calm that animals seemed to trust instantly. Her eyes, a soft brown with hints of gold, could shift in an instant from gentleness to razor focus, depending on what was placed in front of her. Tonight, the moment she saw Caleb's expression, they sharpened. "What happened?" she demanded, her voice firm but steady as she ushered them into the emergency room. "Found them in the snow on Cambria Ridge. This one." Caleb gently pulled the cream puppy forward, barely breathing. Nora didn't waste a second. She took Ivory into her hands with the practiced movements of someone who had done this thousands of times, yet still treated every life like the first one she ever fought to save. Ivory's body was frighteningly cold, so cold Nora felt her own breath catch. She barked orders at her assistant, a young man named Liam Reyes, 22, lanky and earnest, with a shaved head and a natural nervousness around authority, but gifted hands when it came to animals. Warm saline, heated blankets, oxygen now. Liam sprinted into motion. Nora turned to the black puppy, still pressed against Caleb's chest. And this one? Cuts, limping, exhausted, but won't leave the other. Nora reached out. The puppy growled, low and trembling. Caleb stroked the pup's head. "It's okay, little guy." Nora's voice softened as she examined him, without forcing separation. Male, older by a few weeks, underweight, frostbite starting on the ears, but stable. She narrowed her eyes. "He dragged that other one through a blizzard?" "Looks like it," Nora exhaled. "Then he's got heart." Caleb gently placed Rook on the exam table, but the puppy immediately tried to stand again, inching toward Ivory even though the distance was only a few feet. His injured leg buckled and his small body shook with effort. Liam returned with equipment, and Nora began assessing Ivory. She lifted one eyelid and frowned deeply. "Core temperature is extremely low, heart rate weak, breathing shallow. If we don't raise her temperature soon, we'll lose her." Caleb stood close, unconsciously positioning himself between the storm outside and the small life lying on the table. Nora wrapped Ivory in warmed blankets, then connected her to a heated IV bag. "You're lucky we're staffed tonight," she muttered, though her tone held no complaint. Only focus. The snow battered against the windows as if demanding entry, but inside the room, calm precision reigned. Caleb stepped aside for a moment to search the torn duffel bag. There was a faint smell of old hay and gasoline clinging to the fabric. He pulled out a bald piece of paper, wet along the edges. When he unfolded it, the ink was smudged but readable. Can't afford them. Do whatever you want. No name, no address, no explanation. Something heavy and cold settled in Caleb's chest. He had seen abandonment before, too many times, but rarely wrapped in this kind of cruelty. Nora glanced at the note and shook her head slowly. People always think animals are disposable. They're wrong. Caleb pocketed the note. I'll report it. You do that, Nora said, adjusting Ivory's oxygen line. But right now, we focus on the one thing we can still save, this little life right here. Rook whined again, pulling himself toward Ivory. Caleb knelt beside him, one large hand resting gently on the pup's back. The puppy's coat was thick but tangled, with snowmelt dripping off in uneven lines. His body shivered not just from cold, but from fear. Fear older and deeper than any puppy should know. Caleb spoke softly, the way he once spoke to frightened children at accident scenes. She's in good hands, buddy. She's not alone anymore. Something softened in Rook's eyes. He pressed his head against Caleb's palm and let out a breathy sound that was half sigh, half sob. Nora glanced over briefly. He chose her as family, she murmured. That kind of bond. You don't see it often. Hours passed in a blur of monitored vitals, adjusted blankets, whispered instructions, and the faint hum of heated equipment. Caleb stayed through every minute, helping where he could, calming Rook, handing Nora supplies, calling dispatch with updates between procedures. Outside, the blizzard raged with merciless beauty. Inside, 3 humans and 1 loyal pup fought against the quiet, stealing breath from a smaller one. As dawn approached, the storm eased. The wind calmed into a low sigh across the ridge. But Ivory's condition did not improve. Her heart rate weakened. Her breaths turned thin. Liam looked up, worried. Doctor, I see it, Nora said grimly. She moved fast, checking vitals, adjusting equipment, warming Ivory's chest with her hands as though willing life back into her. When the monitor beeped in uneven rhythm, Rook let out a sharp, pained cry, pawing toward the table. Caleb caught him gently. Easy. She's fighting. Nora's expression tightened. But she can't fight alone. She increased the heated fluids, adjusted the oxygen concentration, and watched, breath held in a way she didn't allow herself often. Finally, she stepped back. If she makes it through the next hour, she has a chance. Caleb nodded, though his throat felt tight. Rook leaned into him, exhausted, eyes fixed on Ivory. The sun had not yet risen, but the storm clouds thinned enough to let a faint blue glow seep through the clinic windows. The blizzard had passed, survival still hung by a thread. Inside that single warm room, however small, however fragile, the storm had met its first resistance, not from machines, but from devotion. The devotion of a puppy who refused to abandon his only family, and a man who could not walk away from lives placed in his hands. The first night did not end with sunrise. It stretched endlessly, bending time into something heavy and uncertain within the small emergency room of Whitlock Animal Care. The storm outside had faded into a distant murmur along Cambria Ridge. But inside the clinic, the real battle had only just begun. Ivory lay motionless beneath layered warm blankets, her fragile body connected to tubes and wires that whispered life back into her blood, one measured drop at a time. The heart monitor pulsed weakly, each uneven beep sounding like a question rather than an answer. Rook refused to rest. The black puppy sat at the edge of the metal treatment table, his injured leg trembling under his weight, ears lowered, but eyes wide and unblinking. Every breath Ivory took, or failed to take, was mirrored in the tight rise and fall of his small chest. Though no one had taught him how to understand machines, he sensed what mattered. Every change in sound pulled a low whine from his throat. Officer Caleb Rowan remained at his side. The badge on his chest felt heavier than it ever had on duty. He had seen gunshot wounds, fatal crashes, children lost in storm water, and men broken by their own mistakes. But this, the slow uncertainty of waiting, stripped him in ways violence never could. His presence tonight was no longer dictated by protocol. It was dictated by something quieter, something human. Dr. Nora Whitlock moved between equipment with the solemn calm of a seasoned guardian. 30 years of veterinary emergencies had shaped her into someone who never rushed, yet never wasted a second. She adjusted Ivory's fluid levels with steady hands, listening not just to monitors, but to the subtle signs of a body deciding whether to stay or surrender. Her assistant, Liam Reyes, hovered nearby, nervously checking readings. His youthful face drawn tight with fear, he tried unsuccessfully to hide. "She's holding," Liam whispered at one point. "For now," Nora replied softly. "Hypothermia lies. It lets you believe you've won before it steals the ground beneath your feet." Rook reacted to every word spoken near Ivory as though it were part of her vital signs. Whenever the monitor faltered even slightly, he released a plaintive cry, thin but piercing, his body leaning forward until Caleb gently steadied him back. The puppy's small frame quivered constantly, whether from cold, fear, or exhaustion. It was impossible to tell. Yet he did not sleep. Not even for a breath. At one point, Caleb slid down into the chair beside the table, exhaustion pulling at his spine. Rook immediately leaned against his knee, pressing his head into the crook of Caleb's leg as if anchoring himself to a living thing that would not disappear without warning. Caleb laid his hand over the pup's back and felt the rapid pulse beneath fur still damp from melted snow. "You're stronger than you know," Caleb murmured. The words were meant for Rook, but they carried pieces of Caleb himself. The night stretched forward like a frozen road with no landmarks. Ivory did not wake. Her breathing remained shallow, her tiny chest rising only with assisted warmth and oxygen. Nora stayed long past the hours anyone could reasonably expect of her, refusing to leave while the line between life and death remained so thin. Near dawn, a faint tremor passed through Ivory's body. For a moment, the monitor hesitated. Liam gasped. Nora leaned in instantly, adjusting the oxygen flow, warming Ivory's chest with her palms. "Easy," she whispered, though no one could say whether the word was meant for herself or for the fragile life beneath her hands. The monitor steadied again. Rook let out a trembling sound, half relief, half plea. Morning came in soft gray through the frosted windows. The storm had broken. Pinecrest stirred slowly back into existence beyond the glass. Cars moved cautiously through snow-choked streets. Lights flickered back on as power returned. Life resumed its rhythm outside, unaware that inside this single room it was still hanging by a thread. Caleb made his calls, updating reports, filing the initial incident record. Yet he did not leave. Coffee sat untouched on the counter. Rook did not shift. Nora finally lowered herself onto a stool, removing her gloves. "If she survives the first 24 hours," she said quietly, "she might make it." Caleb exhaled a breath he had not realized he was holding. But hope is rarely kind enough to remain simple. The second night came colder than the first, not in temperature, but in tension. Ivory showed no significant improvement. Her tiny body remained locked in a fragile equilibrium, neither sinking nor rising. Rook grew weaker with fatigue. His eyelids drooped repeatedly but snapped open every time the monitor changed pitch. His injured leg had swollen during the day, but he ignored the pain entirely, every ounce of his focus devoted to Ivory. That night, as the clock crept past midnight, the monitor emitted a sudden flat cry. Ivory stopped breathing. Time shattered. Nora moved instantly. All hesitation burned away in the crucible of experience. "She's crashing!" Liam rushed to stabilize the lines. Caleb scooped Rook into his arms just as the puppy lunged forward in panic, tiny body straining with every ounce of strength to reach Ivory. For 12 unbearable seconds, Ivory did not breathe. The seconds stretched into something monstrous. 12 seconds that carried the weight of days, of storms crossed, of a bond forged through suffering far too early for lives so small. Then, a tremor. A shallow, gasping breath tore free from Ivory's chest. The monitor stuttered, then pulsed again. Nora adjusted oxygen and fluids with controlled urgency, her jaw set, eyes fierce with concentration. The emergency passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind only trembling silence. Rook, still in Caleb's arms, let out a broken sound that barely resembled a bark. It was a sound carved from fear and relief layered together. Caleb held him close, feeling the violent tremor racking the small body. Nora finally stepped back. Her shoulders sank just enough to reveal the strain she had been carrying. That was close, she admitted softly. Too close. Caleb found his voice at last. Will she? I don't know, Nora said honestly. But she chose to breathe again. Rook wriggled out of Caleb's grip and limped back to the side of the table, placing his head near Ivory's paw, eyes fixed on her chest, as if daring it to remain still again. The second dawn came quietly. Snow glittered under pale winter light beyond the windows. Ivy tendrils of frost traced the edges of the glass. Pinecrest looked peaceful from within the clinic, but peace inside was still only borrowed. Nora gathered herself and addressed Caleb in a low voice near the doorway. There's another matter you need to be prepared for. Caleb turned to her. If an owner appears, or if evidence of abuse or abandonment leads to a criminal case, both puppies may be classified as evidence, she said. They could be seized for the investigation. Caleb nodded slowly. He understood the procedure well. They won't be adopted until the case is resolved, Nora continued, no matter how long it takes. Caleb glanced back at Rook and Ivory. The black puppy lay pressed against the table leg, guarding with exhausted devotion. The cream one lay silent beneath the blankets, still fighting in tiny, unseen ways. I understand, Caleb said. Yet when Rook lifted his head and pressed it gently against Caleb's chest again, trembling with fear that this fragile victory could still be taken away, the law suddenly felt colder than the snow outside. Caleb lowered himself into the chair once more, allowing the small guardian to curl against him. And in that moment, without words, without ceremony, he made a promise that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the slow awakening of a heart he had believed frozen beyond repair. The third day crept into Pinecrest beneath a pale winter sun, the kind that carried no warmth but lent the illusion of mercy. Snow no longer fell in violent curtains, yet the town remained buried beneath what the storm had left behind. Rooftops sagged under white weight. Telephone lines glistened like frozen veins. The mountain ridge loomed in the distance, silent and watchful, as though it had merely paused between tempests. Inside Whitlock Animal Care, the air was thick with antiseptic warmth and a fragile, stubborn hope. Rook had regained a measure of strength by morning. Though his injured leg still forced a slight hitch in his gait, his appetite returned in cautious fragments, and the tremor that once ruled his body had lessened. He moved carefully now, with the wariness of something that had learned too early that survival was never guaranteed. He was still very young, yet his dark eyes carried the gravity of something far older. Nora observed him quietly as she worked, noting how he never strayed more than a few feet from Ivory's kennel. Each time Ivory stirred, however faintly, Rook's ears lifted instantly, alert as a sentinel. Ivory showed small signs of return to the living world. Her breathing deepened slightly. Once, her eyelids fluttered open just enough to reveal a haze of pale awareness before exhaustion dragged her back under. It was not recovery, but it was not surrender either. Caleb remained present through much of that day. Though his official duties called him back to the road, something invisible tethered him to the clinic. When he did leave, it was only for patrol rounds, his eyes constantly scanning the snow-heavy streets as though expecting the storm itself to rise again with intent. The town of Pinecrest moved slowly, residents emerging to shovel paths, check on neighbors, repair frozen pipes. Christmas lights blinked uncertainly against the daylight, half buried beneath frost. By early evening, the sky deepened into twilight once more. Nora was adjusting Ivory's monitors when she noticed the reflection first, an unnatural stillness in the glass. Across the street, where snow had been plowed into uneven banks, a dark blue pickup truck idled at the curb. Its engine remained running, yet no door opened, no lights flashed. It simply waited. The man inside was difficult to see through the frost-laced windshield. All that could be made out at first was a heavy silhouette seated behind the wheel. When his face did briefly turn toward the clinic, Nora caught the faint glint of eyes, flat and unblinking. She felt an inexplicable chill ripple beneath her skin. The truck did not move for several minutes. Then, without warning, it pulled away. Nora did not dismiss the unease as coincidence. She stepped into the corridor and alerted Liam, who glanced nervously toward the windows. "You think he was watching?" "I don't think," Nora replied. "I feel." She called Caleb. Within minutes, his patrol vehicle rolled quietly up the street. He had returned without siren or spectacle, instinct guiding him rather than protocol. Nora explained what she had seen. Caleb scanned the road where the truck had vanished, his jaw tightening slightly. "Front plate?" he asked. "No." "That's legal in Wisconsin," Caleb muttered. "Makes it harder to trace." The unease settled deeper. Caleb remained in the area for some time before resuming patrol. The rest of the evening passed without incident. The clinic lights glowed as they always had. Rook slept for the first time since the rescue, curled beside Ivory's kennel, one paw stretched through the bars to rest against her blanket. Then, shortly after midnight, the quiet broke. A faint metallic scrape echoed through the back hallway. Nora stiffened in her chair. The sound was subtle, barely more than the whisper of metal against wood. But in a place where most nights passed in sterile quiet, it carried far more weight than it should have. She rose slowly, motioning for Liam to stay near the front desk. Together, they advanced toward the rear door. The lock bore fresh scratches. Someone had tried to force it. Nora's pulse quickened. She immediately checked the medication cabinets, the equipment, the storage room. Nothing was missing. Yet the sense of intrusion remained like a fingerprint in the air. They reviewed the rear security camera. Snow obscured everything. The lens had been entirely covered by wind-driven frost during the storm, rendering the footage nothing but shifting white static. By the time Caleb returned, the damage had already been documented. He examined the lock carefully, crouched low, gloved fingers brushing the splintered wood. "Whoever it was," he said quietly, "they were cautious, tested entry, didn't commit." Nora folded her arms tightly across her chest. Or they didn't find what they were looking for. They exchanged a look heavy with shared realization. Caleb called for temporary increase in patrol frequency around the clinic. Though Pinecrest had no true tactical unit, a small rotating response team, what locals half-jokingly called mini SWAT, was placed on standby should the need arise. It was not paranoia. It was preparedness. That night, Caleb chose not to go home. He brought coffee he would barely touch, a small blanket he would not unfold, and a steady presence that both humans and animals sensed immediately. He settled into the chair beside the treatment room where Ivory lay. Rook shifted closer to him, without hesitation. The puppy's coat, once dull with frost and grime, now shone with subdued health beneath clinic lights. Yet his eyes never lost their alertness. Each distant sound triggered a lift of his head, ears twitching. He was no longer merely a frightened survivor. He had become a watcher. Ivory remained nestled in warmth, chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. The machines hummed softly around, her like mechanical guardians. Midnight passed, then 1 o'clock, then 2. The clinic existed in its own suspended world between night and morning. Outside, Pinecrest slept beneath layered snow. Inside, a quiet vigil endured. Caleb's eyes grew heavy, yet he resisted sleep. Each time he blinked too long, he startled awake with the echo of old sirens in his memory. He studied Rook in the half-light, the way the small body remained angled protectively toward Ivory's kennel, even in rest, the slight twitching of paws as if dreaming of movement. It stirred something deep in Caleb's chest, an aching recognition of what it meant to guard what little remained when everything else had been stripped away. At some point before dawn, exhaustion claimed him despite his will. His head tipped forward, his breathing deepened. Rook shifted immediately. He rose, limping softly, and pressed himself against Caleb's boots, curling as close as his small body could manage without losing sight of Ivory. It was not fear that drove him now, but instinctive companionship. Even in sleep, he anchored himself to the man who had brought them out of the snow. The hour before dawn carried the deepest quiet. Then the wind whispered again along the ridge. Caleb stirred. For a moment, he did not know where he was. The warmth, the quiet beeping, the faint scent of antiseptic replaced the storm in his memory. Rook lifted his head at the same instant. They listened together. Nothing moved. Yet the sense of being watched remained, faint but persistent, like the echo of unseen footsteps in fresh snow. Across town, somewhere beyond the clinic's protective light, a blue pickup truck rested in darkness, its engine long cold, its presence lingering only in the unease it left behind. And in the single warm room, where fragile lives clung stubbornly to breath, danger did not yet strike, but it drew closer. Christmas morning arrived without celebration. The light over Pinecrest was pale and brittle, as though the sun itself hesitated to disturb the hush left behind by the storm. Snow lay smooth and unbroken across rooftops and sidewalks, a deceptive calm that made the town look like a postcard instead of a place that still carried danger in its shadows. The clinic windows glowed faintly as dawn crept across the street, but inside Whitlock Animal Care, something was wrong before anyone even spoke it aloud. Dr. Nora Whitlock was the first to sense the absence. After decades of practice, she could feel when a room's balance shifted. She stepped into the treatment room with her morning coffee still warm in her hand and froze mid-step. The heated kennel where Ivory had rested through the night was empty. The blankets lay tangled and disturbed, warmth lingering without the small body it was meant to protect. "Ivory?" Nora whispered, as if the word itself might pull the puppy back into being. Her heart began to race. Liam hurried in behind her, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "What's wrong?" Nora pointed silently. The young assistant's face drained of color as understanding struck. Rook reacted instantly. The black puppy, who had slept pressed against Caleb's boots through the night, jerked upright with a sharp, frightened yelp. He limped toward the kennel, nose working rapidly, confusion rippling through every line of his body. He whined once, high, broken, disbelieving. Caleb was on his feet in a heartbeat. "Check the doors," he ordered, already moving. The front door was locked. The rear door stood closed, but the faint cold draft at ankle level betrayed a breach. Nora reached the back room first. The small window above the storage counter sat slightly ajar, a thin line of winter air cutting into the warm clinic like a knife. Snow dusted the sill inside. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture. Whoever had taken Ivory had done so cleanly, quickly, and with purpose. Caleb's jaw tightened as he radioed dispatch. "Possible abduction from Whitlock Animal Care. One injured German Shepherd puppy taken, initiating immediate response." Rook was already at the back door, whining urgently, pawing at the threshold. The puppy's nose dropped low, pressing to the thin line of snow where the inside heat met the outside cold. His body stiffened. A low, urgent sound rolled from his chest. Not fear this time, but recognition. Caleb opened the door. Outside, the snow was unspoiled except for one detail that sliced through the perfection of the white surface like a scar. Fresh tire tracks. The snow was still warm around their edges, not yet hardened by the cold. Whoever had come had not left long ago. Caleb crouched low, examining the tread pattern. "These are recent. Very recent." Rook strained against the invisible boundary at the doorway, the pull of the trail overwhelming his injured leg. He whined and scratched. At the petitioner's table, wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Her makeup was heavier than usual, the kind you wear when you're trying to hide stress or sleepless nights. Brandon sat beside her in a suit jacket that looked like it came from the clearance rack at a department store. His leg bounced under the table like he was late for somewhere important, and his expression suggested he still thought this was all some kind of misunderstanding that would get sorted out once the adults started talking. The moment Linda saw me, her jaw tightened into a line that could cut glass. Brandon turned and gave me a look that somehow managed to be both defiant and pleading. "Nice of you to show up," he said, loud enough for half the courtroom to hear. Jonathan put a hand on my arm. "Save it for the judge," he murmured. Judge William Morrison entered with the tired authority of a man who'd spent 20 years listening to people blame each other for their poor decisions. He was tall, thin, with silver hair, and glasses that sat halfway down his nose like he was perpetually examining something distasteful. Case number 24 FC 1187, Ramirez versus Ramirez. Hearing my own name announced like that made something in my stomach twist, but it also felt like the starting bell for a fight I'd been training for without knowing it. Linda stood immediately, and her voice carried that particular blend of wounded innocence and righteous indignation she'd perfected over the years. "Your Honor, my husband abandoned our family without warning. He froze our joint accounts, stole money that was designated to help my son during a business crisis, and disappeared across state lines to avoid his responsibilities as a husband and family provider." Stole money. The woman who'd forged my signature on loan documents was accusing me of theft. Judge Morrison raised his hand. "Mrs. Ramirez, you'll have your opportunity to present your case. Please be seated." She sat down hard, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself, like someone bracing for impact. Jonathan rose and placed a thick folder on the table in front of him. "Your Honor, we have extensive documentation demonstrating that my client didn't abandon his family, but removed himself from an ongoing pattern of financial fraud and emotional abuse." A murmur passed through the gallery. Linda's head snapped toward me, with a look that could have stripped paint. "Included in our evidence," Jonathan continued, opening the folder with the ceremony of someone unveiling a masterpiece, "are business loan applications bearing forged signatures, unauthorized access to home equity lines, attempts to liquidate retirement accounts without consent, and documentation of threats made when Mr. Ramirez refused to pay debts incurred without his knowledge." Linda shot to her feet. "That is absolutely untrue. Mrs. Ramirez," with a deep-set scowl etched into a face marked by years of hard living. His jacket bore the faded logo of a local kennel that had shut down the previous year. The instant Caleb saw that symbol, understanding snapped into place. The man lunged for the door. He did not make it 3 steps. The team tackled him swiftly, forcing him to the cold floor, cuffs biting into his wrists as he shouted and struggled. His protests were incoherent, drowned beneath adrenaline and fury. When Caleb reached the crate, he dropped to his knees without hesitation. He lifted Ivory gently, wrapping her fragile body against his chest to shield her from the freezing air. Her heartbeat fluttered weakly beneath his palm. "She's alive," he said into the radio. "We have her." Outside, the moment Caleb stepped into the open air with Ivory in his arms, Rook's voice shattered the quiet. The black puppy barked wildly, a thin, desperate sound torn from the center of his small body. He pressed his face against the window of the patrol vehicle, paws scrabbling against glass. Caleb hurried toward him. The instant Ivory's scent reached Rook, the puppy erupted into frantic movement. He was released only after the scene was fully secured. Despite his injured leg, Rook burst forward with trembling speed, crashing gently against Caleb's knees as he tried to reach Ivory. Caleb lowered the cream puppy toward him. Rook licked Ivory's face with frantic devotion, whining brokenly as though scolding her for disappearing. His tail whipped through the cold air in wild arcs, joy and terror blurring together in every motion. Ivory let out the faintest sound, a tiny breath that might have been a whimper, or might have been recognition. The world exhaled. The man was led away in cuffs, face twisted with rage and defeat. The officers exchanged grim looks. Word would spread fast through Pinecrest that the storm had unearthed more than abandoned animals. It had uncovered a wound left festering for too long. Caleb carried Ivory back toward the clinic as the pale Christmas sun climbed slowly higher, casting light across the snow that now looked less like burial and more like promise. Rook walked beside him every step of the way, limping but unyielding, eyes never leaving his sister. And behind them, the warehouse fell silent once more. The storm released Pinecrest slowly, as though winter itself were reluctant to loosen its grip. By the time the case was formally closed, the snow had settled into quiet hills along the streets, the town breathing again beneath layers of white. News of the warehouse arrest traveled fast through cafes, barbershops, and church steps. The man who had taken Ivory was charged swiftly, his name now spoken with the mixture of anger and relief reserved for threats that had been seen clearly at last. Officially, Rook and Ivory were declared victims, not long-term evidence. The law, so often a cold instrument, allowed space for mercy this time. Yet healing does not follow legal timetables. Ivory remained fragile for weeks. Her lungs strengthened slowly. Her small body gained weight by measured ounces. Each day brought another cautious victory. Standing for a moment without trembling, drinking on her own, lifting her head without collapsing back into the blankets. Nora watched her progress with quiet satisfaction. A woman who had learned never to celebrate too loudly before survival had signed its final confirmation. Rook became her constant shadow once more. He no longer trembled as he once had, yet his vigilance did not wane. He slept where he could see her. He ate only after she had taken her fill. When she stumbled, he pressed his small shoulder against her side to steady her. He was still young, barely past his 4th month, but responsibility had settled into his bones with unnatural ease. His coat darkened into health, his injured leg healed into a permanent but faint stiffness, a reminder of the road he had dragged himself across for love. Caleb visited often during those weeks, sometimes in uniform, sometimes not. Each time he stepped through the clinic doors, Rook lifted his head instantly, tail thumping once against the floor, not with wild excitement, but with recognition. Ivory learned his scent too. On better days, she would stretch her nose toward him and release a soft sound that might have been greeting or gratitude. The day the adoption notice went up, Nora felt the weight of it heavier than she expected. A small printed page pinned near the reception desk read, "Two German Shepherd puppies seeking joint or separate adoption pending final medical clearance." The first family arrived within hours. They were kind people, local, well-meaning. The husband was tall and broad with gentle eyes. The wife had a soft voice and warm hands. They had raised dogs before. Their home had space. They asked careful questions. They knelt to meet Rook at eye level, smiling as he studied them with cautious politeness. They reached toward Ivory, then hesitated. "She's still so weak," the wife said gently. Nora nodded. "She will need continued monitoring, follow-up care, and patience." The husband exchanged a brief look with his wife. "We were really hoping for the black one. We think he'll grow strong. We're not sure we can handle a medical case as well." The words were not cruel, they were practical, but practicality does not always understand love. When they reached for Rook's collar, something changed. The black puppy stiffened instantly. He glanced back toward Ivory. Then he did something that silenced the room. He sat down. He did not move. He did not growl. He simply refused. Ivory, weak but aware, shifted on her blanket and let out a faint sound. Rook rose instantly and pressed himself against her side, as if answering a summons only he could hear. The family stepped back. "I think," the wife whispered. They belonged together. They left without bitterness. 2 days passed, then another family, then another. Some admired Rook's strength, some pitied Ivory's fragility. None would take both. Nora began to fear what she had not allowed herself to voice, that love, despite all its beauty, might not be enough to secure them a home together. Caleb arrived that evening after patrol, snow still clinging to the edge of his boots. He stood quietly near the doorway as Nora explained the situation, her voice steady, but tight with restrained emotion. "They don't want to separate," she said, "but the world does." Caleb said nothing at first. He knelt beside Rook and Ivory instead. Rook rose immediately, tail low but steady, gaze searching Caleb's face with quiet intensity. Ivory lifted her head with effort. Caleb looked at them for a long time. Once, long ago, he had stood in a hospital hallway much like this one, surrounded by white walls and waiting machines, praying the world would not demand separation again. The world had not listened. This time, it had given him a choice. He stood and turned back to Nora. "If no one will take both," he said softly, "then I will." The room held its breath. Nora stared at him, disbelief flickering across her face before breaking into something like laughter mixed with tears. "You're serious?" "I've never been more certain of anything," Caleb said. The paperwork moved quickly after that. Background checks were a formality. No one in Pinecrest questioned Caleb Rowan's capacity for responsibility. The town had watched him stand between them and storms for years. This time, the storm had given him something back. Ivory remained under clinic care for another 2 weeks. When the day came to take her home, the sky cleared as if in quiet agreement. It was Christmas night. The snow stopped. Pinecrest glowed with small lights and fragile joy. The town still wounded, but alive with what it had salvaged. Caleb drove carefully along the ridge road to his cabin, a small structure tucked against the slope where pine trees shielded it from the worst of the wind. The windows burned with warm light. Smoke curled upward from the chimney like a promise written into the cold. Inside, the fire crackled. Caleb set Ivory gently onto a thick rug near the hearth. Rook, I stepped in behind her, cautious at first, ears twitching at the unfamiliar sounds. The warmth wrapped around them instantly, seeping into bones, still learning what safety felt like. Ivory eased onto her side, exhausted but peaceful. Rook curled beside her without hesitation. For a long time, none of them moved. The world outside the windows lay frozen and silent, but inside, the flames whispered, the pups breathed, and the air carried no fear. Rook lifted his paw and placed it gently across Ivory's back. Ivory shifted closer. Caleb stood at the edge of the room, hands resting loosely at his sides. He had carried many burdens in his life. Tonight, for the first time in years, he felt he had been given something instead. He smiled, not the guarded half-smiles he offered on duty, but a real one. A family had formed, not by blood, but by shared storms, shared survival, and a choice made in quiet defiance of loss. Small, silent, yet strong enough to light the longest winter. In the quiet closing of this story, we are reminded that the miracles of God do not always arrive with thunder or bright signs in the sky. Sometimes they come softly through a loyal dog who refuses to give up, through a weary man who chooses kindness again, and through small moments of courage that appear in the middle of our ordinary days. In our own lives, we walk through storms of fear, worry, and loneliness. Yet God walks beside us even when we cannot feel His hand guiding us. Every act of love we give, every step of compassion we choose, becomes a place where His quiet miracles can grow. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what this story meant to you, and type Amen if you believe that God still sends gentle miracles into our lives. May God bless you and your family with peace, protection, and strength in every season. And please remember to press subscribe to support our channel so we can continue bringing stories of faith, love, and second chances to you.